Welcome back into One-on-One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. We're joined now with a very, very special guest. I don't give two varies, very often there. So that's an honor in itself. CBS, college basketball insider, Jon Rothstein. Jon, thanks so much for joining the show. I want to get started with obviously your partnership with FanDuel that you just announced on Twitter the other day, kind of wondering how that came together, what we can be expecting on that front.
Well, guys, first off, it's great to be with you. I hope that you enjoy the Oreo cheesecake at Pasquale Rigoletto's as much as I do because, I'm a big Arthur Avenue guy. So yes. I hope you're big fans of a good dessert, which is a short trot from your campus. But, to be honest, there's not going to be that much difference than what I've already been doing. I think the one thing, and I'm sure you guys have seen this as aspiring people in the media, is that the media landscape, especially digitally, has changed so much in the last 5 or 10 years. I'm somebody who always knew that he wanted to do college basketball. I did talk radio for a while, especially here in New York. I was a talk show host for 6 years at ESPN Radio New York, but I knew I wanted to cover college basketball. And if you weren't a player and if you weren't a coach, obviously the thought was, well, you got to obviously have a TV job and you got to obviously have a writing platform. And I would say probably 5-6 years ago, you really saw that there just wasn't much of an effort to really have high profile writing assignments in college basketball. I think, other than The Athletic, nobody is really doing it. I did it for CBSSports.com for a number of years. There wasn't a lot of support in that area. And after bouncing around and doing some different things and, having some opportunities at different places, I felt that I was doing so many different things in terms of, writing, and I had a podcast, and I launched my own merchandise line a couple of years ago at collegehoopstoday.com, which I'm proud to say, my portion of the proceeds goes to charity, a great charity, and mission continues. I was doing all these things and creating all this content, especially when I was going out to campuses and seeing practices, that I said, you know what? I think, it's time to kind of be authentic, be a little bit entrepreneurial, and kind of do all this stuff to sharpen my knife, so to speak, so that I'm the best I can when I'm doing a podcast, when I'm doing a studio show. And FanDuel had interest in all of it. FanDuel just wanted to be a partner in all of it because, I don't think about this, but, if I need to do a breakdown of a Fordham St. Louis game and, talk obviously about the impact that Francis Okoro can have on the inside as a transfer from Oregon, there's a market for that. So, I was very excited when they showed interest in becoming a partner, and, it's going to be a fantastic partnership for a long time. It's really been a fun start out of the gate with FanDuel.
Jon, you were actually talking to the two guys that were calling that Fordham St. Louis game. So it's just a hilarious coincidence I had to point out. But I want to sort of go back to your origins. I want to ask you how you got started at CBS. What was the hiring process like? And what did you, I guess, go through to get this position to where you are now?
Well, nothing obviously happens overnight. I think it was Charlie Chaplin said it took him his whole life to be an overnight success story. I was doing, the college basketball insider role for MSG Network for 3 years before I went to CBS. And, in addition to that, I was also doing updates, reporting, fill-in talk show hosts for ESPN Radio New York. But I would always get more of a platform during March because of, the Rolodex that I had, because of the knowledge that I had, and because I was also doing a lot of freelance college basketball writing at the time. So prior to CBS and Turner's partnership, you guys remember, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember this, but prior to this partnership, it used to be just one game was on CBS and that was it. So CBS Digital came up with something called March Madness On Demand. Now, what that was is if there were 4 games going on at one time, if there were 2 games going on at one time, you could watch the other games online, and there was a studio show needed to do half times and post games and things like that. And in March 2010, I was able to join CBS as part of March, Madness On Demand. So the following season, CBS Sports Network, which then was CBS College Sports, hired me as their college basketball insider. Now, this was much different because CBS Sports Network does not have, the inventory that it has now. We had the Mountain West back then. We had the Atlantic 10, and the Mountain West was awesome then. That was the year that Jimmer Fredette was at BYU and Kawhi Leonard was at San Diego State. But we were still only doing a day or two of television. Then all of a sudden, CBS, started to continue to grow. We rebranded CBS Sports Network. They added, obviously a lot of NFL shoulder programming, but then that led to obviously some rights with the Big East, some rights with the West Coast Conference, and really the network has taken off from there. So I joined CBS in 2010. In 2016, I started to contribute to the main CBS broadcast network. And then from there, I did more and more for the broadcast network, contributing in the studio, doing, some sidelines as well. But I also was able to launch a food and basketball series where I sit down with, coaches over a meal. So we've done one this season with Juwan Howard. And also, I'll share here that there is going to be one coming out with me and Rick Pitino here, hopefully in the near future. So there'll be a number of those a year, knock on wood, as long as we continue to move forward out of this pandemic.
I was about to ask you about Rick Pitino and Iona coming up. Obviously, just won his 800th game. But, before that, I've seen some stuff you've done where you talk about how early in your 20s, you'd miss vacations with friends and stuff to cover, teams in the summer and stuff like that, build connections. Wanted to know, obviously, because we're trying to bring into the industry, a lot of us are. How important was it to kind of build those connections for your career?
It's invaluable. And I will say, as I get older, I tell people all the time, look, at some point you're going to want to have a life, but, if you want to have a life before, you have obviously cemented yourself in this business, you will never have a career. And I hope that, makes a lot of sense. Now I'm just, telling this too, full throttle. Like, I've been in situations too, where like, I'll have to go out with my wife and her friends and like, I'm streaming games on my phone while like they're ordering sushi. So like that happens too. But I think it's important to understand that if this is what you want to do, you can never, ever really like assume or never really expect that you are going to have a regular calendar with holidays and obviously birthdays and things like that. It does not exist in our business. You have to be flexible. And, I think the people who are willing to embrace that are the ones who separate themselves. But yeah, no, I remember in 2007, which is when I, started, to have an opportunity to contribute at the MSG network. And I got hired in the 07-08 season. And I was doing a ton of stuff for 1050, and I was writing so much freelance and so on and so forth, trying to get my tentacles out there as much as I could. There are 52 weeks in the year. I think I work 7 days a week, 45 or 46 of the 52 weeks. So it's just the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, the grind is real, but I want to move on to another grind that is Fordham men's basketball. The program has once again flipped. This time, Kyle Neptune is in charge after Jeff Neubauer. And there are a lot of things that I personally can go into as just someone who's been around the program for quite a long time. So I've seen a lot. Yeah. But I want to get your opinions, John, on what you think Kyle Neptune is doing so far and how you think you can roadmap this Fordham program moving forward.
Well, I think the hard thing too is everybody wants to make comments and predictions when somebody's never been a head coach before, and you can't do it. So we had to see Kyle run a program. We had to see how Kyle's teams would play, how they would practice. And he has checked every box in terms of what, he's been able to do now. And I don't want to obviously, dampen the mood here. Fordham had a great win. Okay. And Antonio Day made a layup over Duquesne, I believe, to give Fordham, a real momentum win, early in the Atlantic 10 slate. And then obviously he had to remove himself from school and, he left the program. Fordham can't afford things like that to happen and still have breakthrough seasons. So, it's hard enough when you're talking about a program that hasn't been in the NCAA tournament now in over 30 years for Fordham to get over the hump. But I'll say this, all of the other stuff, when we talk about, culture, which is an overused term a little bit, when we talk about obviously demeanor, when we talk about accountability, Kyle's checking all those boxes. And I think, the good thing when you look at obviously what Fordham has coming in is Kyle's recruiting very well. So all of that is, are all real positives right now, but you can't be a program like Fordham, a team that, again, hasn't been to the NCAA tournament in 3 decades, and have your best offensive player and lead guard leave the program and still be a team that's going to make, an unexpected jump.
And that win over Duquesne, I think it had Fordham tied for second in the A-10 at the time. And I wanted to shift over to the A-10 in general. Look, it's a fascinating league. There's so much parity. Really, we're seeing this year teams can beat whoever on any given day. wondering from what your perspective is, how many bids could we be looking for, and your thoughts on the A10 in general?
I don't think you're going to get more than 2 teams in the Atlantic 10. I think it could be 1 if we continue on this trajectory and Davidson wins the Atlantic 10 tournament. The Atlantic 10 now, in my opinion, if things break a certain way, is almost viewed as like a mid-major type conference. And it wasn't always that way. And, guys, I've been very outspoken about this, for years. The biggest mistake that the Atlantic 10 ever made was going to 18 league games. And I think if you look at the West Coast Conference this year, the West Coast Conference has 4 teams, very much in the mix for the NCAA tournament. A big reason is the non-conference scheduling flexibility that it has. And, I look at the scenario in the Atlantic 10. The Atlantic 10 8 years ago had as many teams in the NCAA tournament as the ACC. The year before that, in 2013, they had 5 teams in the NCAA tournament. And after the 2013 season, Temple, Xavier, Butler all left the league, and it had more teams in the NCAA tournament the next year. So the Atlantic 10 as a conference, in my opinion, needs to recalibrate its entire approach and find ways, I think, to make sure that it gets the respect nationally that it deserves, because now, the teams really in this conference aren't even being given a chance to really put together the type of at-large situation that deserves. The Atlantic 10 should be, I think, a 3 to 4 bid league every year, and it's not this year.
Yeah, John, I guess moving on to discussion of conferences, let's shift over to the bigger picture, the Power Fives plus the Big East. Who, in your opinion, is probably the deepest conference this year, and who should we be looking out for in those conferences?
Well, I think the Big 12 is clearly the best conference in college basketball. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I think, the one thing that's different this year versus last year is it's the polar opposite. Last year, you knew that Baylor and Gonzaga had separated from the pack pretty early in the season. This year, there's significantly more parity across the board. When you think of the different dynamic in college basketball, there's a number of teams that could win a national championship. I think what we're going to see too here is over the next 5 weeks, different teams are going to continue to emerge. Look, people nationally feel a lot differently about UCLA and Kentucky than they did 7 days ago because of the way those 2 teams performed last week.
Yeah. And, I wanted to ask you something that I always think is really interesting. It's when in the season we can start maybe projecting more towards the tournament, looking, less back on it. So, for example, like BYU had that tough loss to Pacific the other day. When, in your opinion, is it too early or it's time to kind of start looking at March and looking at, bracketology and all that kind of fun stuff?
Well, I obviously, try to do it every day, but I hear what you're saying. I think this is what you got to do, guys. And this is something that I will share with you, that it makes you better at your craft. And it also makes it, I think, a little clearer about how hard it is to get to the NCAA tournament. Like, a lot of people, and you guys are, at Fordham, so you're covering the Atlantic 10, like they'll be like, oh, well, St. Bonaventure's playing Davidson Tuesday. If St. Bonaventure beats Davidson, they're in because they're the best team in the conference, so on and so forth. And that's not the case. Write out 68 slots, then write out all the conferences and them getting an automatic qualifier. Then go through and see who you would put in the tournament. And all of a sudden, you're going to get up to 65 or 66 teams pretty close. So if we're looking at the Atlantic 10, obviously Davidson has the best resume right now out of any team in this conference. But as we get through February, if you start to see a team like a St. Bonaventure, like a Dayton, because they have such a unique resume, go off on a run, remember, they're not competing with other teams in the Atlantic 10 necessarily for a spot in the tournament. They are competing with the Creightons, with the Wyomings, with the San Franciscos, with the North Carolinas. Those are the teams that they're competing with.
John, one more question here really quickly for you. Obviously, you do some sideline reporting for CBS. I have done a little bit for Fordham basketball here and there throughout the season. I guess I'll ask you from perspective of that, what is the number one thing that you like to do going into sideline prep, and what do you try to provide as the sideline reporter?
It's different, so different than the studio. The studio is my favorite thing by far, just because, I obviously cover everything, so you can obviously, chime in on different topics. Sidelines, I think, is about trying to add to the broadcast. Obviously, the play-by-play and the color guy are going to be steering the ship, but you have to go in and you have to bring different dimensions to the broadcast. And for me, as somebody who's been to practices and is always talking to coaches, you just try to obviously lean into that insight and not try to elevate the broadcast as best you can.
Jon, we really appreciate you taking the time. If you follow him on Twitter, you know how busy it is. So we really do know, how gracious he is for taking a few minutes with us. So thank you so much, for that. We will be right back with more one-on-one.